IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to today's episode. I'm Sridhar Krishna, your host for the day, and we are talking about how digital acts as an enabler and also divides society in ways that we never thought it would, right? So for today's discussion, I've got with me my regular colleague and partner in this project, 20 Million Jobs project that we're working on at Takshashila, Aarushi Kataria. And we've also got a guest today, Raghav Rao, and Raghav's from Cleveland. Raghav, do you want to go first and tell us about your interest in the digital divide and tell us something about yourself and how you got interested in this space?
Sure. So I grew up in Bangalore and moved to Cleveland for college, but I actually grew up down the street from Takshashila. But yeah, I like telling everyone that my interest in the digital divide started with a mattress. I had to dispose of an old mattress when I got a new one. And I found out the process was to dispose of a mattress. You have to drive down to City Hall, pay the treasury in cash, then make them call the garbage pickup people, have them know. Then they call you, give you a time, and then they pick it up if you're lucky. And at the same time, I was a graduate student at Case Western doing Internet of Things research in a lab. And we were looking at equipping water trucks with sensors so they can measure vibrations in the road and kind of tell if the road quality was declining. And the contrast between the two really stood out to me. That on one hand, you're trying to equip the city with these advanced sensors and prevent degradation well before it happens, but you still can't pay with credit card at City Hall. So I kind of was at this conference and this professor was talking about future cities, and she kind of interrupted everyone and said, "Hey, can we bring Cleveland to the present before we kind of talk about the future?" And there was a pin drop silence. And so that evening I went home, thinking about this, and I went online and I looked around and I posted on Reddit, on the Cleveland Reddit, saying, "Hey, does anyone know if anyone's working on this?" And this guy responded saying, "Hey, I'm Will from Open Cleveland, and this is exactly what we do." One of their projects was they digitized the form to claim a vacant parking lot next to your building if you want to expand your yard. So they made that completely online. You can use Google Maps, find a map, find a lot. And so that's kind of how I got interested in the idea of, I guess, civic technology and how the average citizen that wants to learn coding or volunteer can actually make a big impact, because these huge projects that Open Cleveland was doing were done by maybe a team of 2 or 3 people, all on their free time. And as I got into that, I realized that a large part of this is just because you build it doesn't mean they'll come. And a large part of that is because a lot of people here can't come because they don't have the access, they don't have the internet. There's zones in Cleveland that don't have that are still using DSL to access the internet, and the rest of the neighborhoods have fiber. So, post-pandemic, when everything's online, those differences really, really start to show. And that's kind of what got me into digital divide and digital equity.
Yeah, I can very well imagine, Raghav, if digital divide is such a big reality in the US, one would not be shocked to know about how digital divide may be driving deep chasms in society in India. Arushi, over to you. What is your interest in this subject? Why don't you tell the audience about some of the work that you're doing in the 20 Million Jobs project and how that sort of got. Anyway, what's your interest in digital divide?
So I think I'd have to go back to my favorite topic of financial literacy, because about 5 years ago is the first time that I understood the digital divide. It was just around the time when demonetization has happened, and magically people were expected to learn how to, do digital payments or have access to a smartphone that would allow them to shift to this completely digital mode of transactions and not rely on cash anymore. And to just see that the very people who worked in an urban school like mine did not have bank accounts sometimes. And, they still relied on their salaries being given to them in cash. And now suddenly they were expected to do all these transactions online. And I think that's the first time we realized that despite the fact that we've said that banking has become so ubiquitous to the urban people, it's really not the case. And the digital divide was more clear than ever before. And I think as over the last 4 to 5 months that I've been working on the 20 million jobs project, a resounding idea has been that almost every solution that we're coming up today in the 21st century to combat and create an environment that will sustainably generate 20 million jobs every single year, our ideas tie back to there being some digital intervention happening. Now, I think if I had to pinpoint very specific examples, when we spoke about the idea of immigration for jobs, where we get people to move to where the jobs really are, where countries are facing labor shortages, we propose the idea of having a jobs portal. A jobs portal does necessarily require overcoming an information arbitrage, but also large digital infrastructure that requires people to be able to access it, for somebody to be updating it in real time, for it to be available in languages that people who are seeking jobs can actually understand it. When we spoke about women's labor force participation, the idea that we had was that jobs need to go where women are. And there are a large number of women who are in the rural areas who are educated but still not able to leave their households for whatever reasons. And given the post pandemic world where we're still working from home, where so many jobs don't rely on people actually going to a physical office, where cities are probably losing their importance. We need to create jobs or create at least structures that would allow these women to access these jobs. Now, this could mean giving them access to handsets, laptops, or giving them access to the internet or teaching them how to even use these devices that they're being handed over. Furthermore, when we talk about even access to credit, we spoke about this linking of people's Jandhan accounts, their Aadhaar cards, and the mobile networks that we spoke about. All of these do rely on there being significant amount of digital infrastructure that is either created from scratch for these ideas, or we need to restructure it in a way where it is not just accessible to those who already have access to it or don't need it, but rather it becomes accessible to those who need it the most.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, isn't it? I mean, I think digital has been fantastic, especially with the pandemic. But for the fact that so many things could be done digitally, the whole world might have come to a standstill. The digital allowed us to continue working. Stanford did a study sometime back during the pandemic and said that, maybe about 50% of Americans were working online. And there were many people who were not working online, who had to go in person and be there. There were frontline workers, retail jobs, etc. And they had to actually be working offline. But about 40% of the people in the US were working from home. But these people who were working from home accounted for more than two-thirds of GDP in the US. So what that means is like two-thirds of your GDP can be just contributed to by people working from home. Means that, wow, I mean, like you can get most of the work done by people sitting at home. But it also means that the people who are having to go out to offline and work are actually those jobs where they are earning less money, they are putting themselves at risk, they're doing everything else. And so this digital is now creating an even greater chasm by allowing people who are more educated, who better paying jobs to sit comfortably in their homes and be safe and work, while those who are earning low wages and are less educated are actually having to go out, put themselves at risk, and earn their living. So digital is not just being a great enabler for the economy to run as though there is no pandemic. I mean, the stock market's doing fantastically well. Everybody's thinking the future is going to be great, and maybe it is, right? But there are a large number of people for whom digital has been not so great. I mean, they haven't had access to it. And Raghav, when we were talking last time, you were talking about a three-legged stool and how those three things are critical to ensure that people are able to go digital. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So I've heard that for digital equity, you actually need a four-legged stool. The three legs isn't enough. The three legs used to be device access, internet access, and digital literacy. But what a lot of people realized is if you give out devices, for free, and that device breaks, and then you go to something like a Best Buy in the US and they charge you $200 to repair that laptop, chances are it's not going to get repaired. So it's not just giving out a device once and done, it's how do you maintain those devices that you've given out. The fourth leg is repair, affordable repair. So places that can do repair at cost or at least subsidized repair to keep those free devices going for years, because devices get lost, devices break. And this model of once and done, let's hand out 1,000 laptops to this neighborhood and then they'll be connected forever is kind of idealistic. So factoring that a lot of those devices will get broken or lost and that you will need to resupply or repair those laptops is a very important leg. And the seat of that is advocacy, because again, if you build it, they won't necessarily come. So at least in Cleveland, there are some great services that do that. There's a nonprofit called PCs for People. They do, repair at cost. They do hand out of cheap devices. The problem is nobody knows about it. One of my friends is telling me about a coworker who desperately needs a laptop and internet service. And I said, "Oh, have you heard of this organization?" And she said, "No, where have they been?" I said, "Right here, just nobody knows about them." So figuring out how to work with local radio stations or people that are interested in spreading the word, because word of mouth is great, but sometimes just funding a marketing campaign and doing some radio ads or newsprint ads, kind of you need that initial push for that word of mouth to then spread and snowball. So the seat of that stool is advocacy. So to list the stool again, it would be access to devices, access to internet, digital literacy, so you know how to use that device on the internet, repairing that device if and when it breaks. It will break, so when it breaks. And the seat of that stool is advocacy.
That's wonderful, because I was during the pandemic, I've had some interesting conversations with people with whom normally I wouldn't have had a chance to talk as much, because I would have been traveling, I would have been at work. But there is this lady who comes home and cooks while we are away, right? That's at least that's what she did. Both of us would go to work, and she would come and she would cook some food, and then that we would have dinner when we come back home. And now that we're both working from home, we meet the cook more often than we used to in the past. So one day, my wife was traveling. She had gone to meet her parents, and the cook came and she asked me, "What should I make for dinner today?" And I hadn't really thought about it, and I was getting into a meeting. So I told her, "Why don't you call my wife and speak to her?" She said, "I don't have a phone." I said, how's that possible? I mean, I thought you had a phone. She said, "No, my kids have online class, and they need to have access to a phone to be able to do the class." So she had to leave her phone behind and travel for work during the time of pandemic, take risks, and leave her phone behind so that her kids could do the online course. At the same time, I was speaking to another friend, Aarushi included, and I asked them about their online classes. And they have, like, a nice MacBook, and they have a second screen, and they have mics, and they have good earphones. They have a quiet room in which they can do this job. There's another thing which happened. I'm also a member of my building's management committee, and we were wanting to hire a manager for our building during the pandemic. And when we were interviewing two people, and one of them was working somewhere, and he was sitting at an office, and he managed to find a room in his office from which he could do the interview. So he came across as competent and articulate, and we could understand what he was saying, and we could hear him. So which is all a big plus. The other guy that we interviewed was trying to do this video call from his phone, and he was standing on the street because he had two kids and his wife at home. His kids were having online classes with school at that time, so he had to stand on the street and do it. And clearly, I mean, he was just not impressive at all. It's very hard for us. Maybe he would have not been impressive even if he had come in person. I don't know. But I do know for a fact that his not having a good internet connection for that interview did make a significant difference to his chances of being selected. So I've seen these two things, and I see that some of us are able to do multiple things. I mean, Arushi, you tell me about your experience during the pandemic and how digital has allowed you to do many more things than you could have done otherwise.
So I think I started with the online learning quite early, March 2020. I think immediately as soon as the lockdown was announced in India, Ashoka went into a complete drive of online classes immediately. There was no lag, or we hoping that the situation gets better. We were one of the few colleges that ended up completing their semester on time. We did not have to, eat into our 3-month long summer break. None of that happened. Over the summer, I was able to work for a company in Bangalore while sitting in Bombay. Over the year, I was able to work for multiple professors across the country, just sitting at home because being at home freed up time that wouldn't have been available had I been on campus. But at the same time, having access to such collaborative technology that allows you to work in real time with each other was a blessing in disguise because you could work on multiple projects. You could clearly demarcate where's what. You could divide your time and you knew how to work with these things. You had the literacy to be able to use things like Google Docs or Google Sheets or Canva or Notion. Um, More recently, I think over the last 7 months, I've been working with Takshashila first with the policy school and now on the 20 million jobs project. And I haven't met a single person from the team in real life. It's completely been online. And I still don't think I would trade that experience for anything just because of how much, even despite it being digital, for me, it's been an enabler because I've been able to learn so much, but I'm not sure if everybody else could say the same thing.
Yeah, thank you very much, Aarushi. That was great. And that's so true. And I think we should talk about some of the challenges and solutions after a short break.
Hey, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Think Fast, Varun and Suchita talked to Shefali Bhatt. She's the tech and culture reporter from The Mint. She gives her views on meme culture, the creator economy, and other internet trends. Check out our new podcast on parenting, Big Talk About Tiny Humans. In the first episode, hosts Devi Shobha and Meghna stress on the importance of eating together as a family. What are the current trends amongst global investors? Viraj Nanda, co-founder of Globalize, tells Anupam all about it on Paisa Vaisa. The Simplified Gang decode all the groundbreaking things that NASA's new James Webb Telescope can do. On All Things Policy, the Takshashila folk discuss the recent Quad Summit that PM Modi was a part of. And on the Filter Coffee podcast, Karthik asks Devaya Bopanna about starting India's first DAO. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Don't forget to rate us on any of the platforms you're listening to us on. And also remember, you can check out a lot of our stuff on YouTube. Go to ivmpodcast.com/YouTube and you'll get a list of all the various channels that we do have. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Bank of Baroda and CoinSwitch Kuber. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Okay, welcome back. And Raghav, do you want to talk about how can we address each of those four things that you talked about, right? You talked about access to devices, you talked about access to the internet, you talked about access to learning, how to use digital devices. You talked about how to get devices repaired and having access to having devices in a working condition at different points. And fifth being, and the seat of the stool being digital advocacy. So, do you want to talk about how each of these things works, and what have you been doing in the states on these issues, so that Aarushi and I can think about how India can adapt and adopt some of these solutions? Yeah.
Sure. So I think the simple answer, the obvious answer is funding. Everything, each of those four legs and the fifth comes down to those organizations having the funding and being stood up by someone that believes in it, because you can't just provide the funding and then have some like hardcore metrics of, okay, we need like so many devices per quarter given out and treat it kind of like a corporate entity. You need someone that understands how slow it is to start, how long it takes to get things rolling. But apart from funding, I think you need someone that is deeply rooted in the community. I think a lot of going online comes with a lot of trust, or you require a lot of trust to convince someone to completely change how they do things, especially when, sometimes you hear about hacking and viruses and ransomware, and there's this whole, I guess that's the stuff that floats to the top on an average person's kind of social media feed is these many hospitals were hit with ransomware, this new virus is out. No one talks about, these million people opened a Word document successfully. Like, that's not a headline. So when you kind of think of going online, at least to some of the people I've talked to, they're pretty scared because they talk about, is it safe to put your credit card number? And it's a mixed answer. There's no guaranteed way to be safe. In a way, they are right. But the same way that there's no chance that you won't be robbed when you walk out of an ATM, like there's no guarantee that you won't get a virus when you go online. You just have to be safe in a different way. And a lot of that work is kind of reduced if you have someone that is deeply trusted in the community, that works with the people and holds their hand through the process. So here in Cleveland, we're very lucky. We have some digital literacy centers that have been around for 20 years that have been pushing this since the early 90s, telling everyone that the future is the internet, telling everyone that everyone needs to know how to use the internet for things to be equal. And because of that, they've built a deep, deep trust with their neighborhoods. And, to this day, if someone calls back and says, I took a class with you 5 years ago, I've forgotten how to do this, they will take the time on the phone and walk them through the whole process. There's also another program in Cleveland suggested by the National Digital Inclusion Alliance called the Digital Navigators. So multiple cities have one. Cleveland recently launched one in November. And what they are is basically tech help for the city, but it's a hotline. It's in conjunction with a lot of libraries and community development corporations and digital literacy centers. And what they do is they get funded by community foundations like the Cleveland Foundation to hire a full-time person that just knows the answers to things like which internet service provider has the cheapest plan, most affordable plan for me, where I broke a laptop, where can I get a new one, or how do I open a Word document to do online banking. But then they're also trained to help them walk through the process of getting a subsidized internet connection and doing the paperwork. So that kind of model where at least before you had to be part of an institution or an office to have an IT team to call. There was no kind of IT help for the city. And so I think that's the third piece is you need this neutral, unaffiliated group of people, preferably hosted by nonprofits, that is the IT number for the city. And that needs funding too. And the analogy I like to use is it's kind of like going to the doctor. If you go to the doctor with knee pain, they're still going to check your heart rate and they're still going to check your blood pressure. So when you call a navigator to ask for help with opening a Word document, they're still going to ask you, what's your family's bandwidth needs? What's the overall internet access like? Does everyone else in your family have devices? So kind of at one shot, even if you called for your Word document, you leave with everyone in your family, hopefully getting their devices met. And if not, at least the navigators know where the gaps in the city are because they're collecting a lot of metrics to show later. Here's where the calls came from, here are the zip codes, here's what they needed versus what they got. So even just that data collection is really important, especially when you're trying to convince corporate funders that this is an important issue and that just having a smartphone isn't enough to be connected in today's world.
Yeah, I know it's interesting. You talk about how there's a need for funding and a need for a non-profit organization which is interested, people in the community who want to help. I think that's wonderful. But I'm also looking at a country like India with over a billion people, right? We have about 1.35, 1.4 billion, almost 1.4 billion people in our country. And 55% of these people live in villages and in rural areas. But what many non-profit organizations, I don't think any non-profit organization in India could have done, let's say, what a Reliance or some of our telecom companies have managed to achieve by providing cheap access to devices. They gave away devices pretty much for free. They gave like telephone access for starters, mobile phone access for starters for a very small fee. And over the last 20 years, India has changed from 20 years ago. I mean, if you really look at telephone access in India, it was 1 out of 7. 1 in 7 households in India had a telephone in the late 90s. While today, there are more telephones than people in India. I was also reading recently that we have about 800 odd million smartphones available in India. So over 60-70% of our population has smartphones. There might be still a big divide between men and women. There is a big divide between rural and urban. There's a big divide based on caste, income, education. But despite all that, I don't think we could have achieved this kind of success without commercial enterprises actually taking the lead to making this a commercially viable enterprise. I mean, like providing telephones to people, providing internet access to people. And do you think it could have, a non-profit organization could have done this?
So I'm not too familiar with modern day India because I left 8 years ago and kind of my adult life has been in the US. And it's very interesting that over there it is companies like Reliance that's doing that. And over here those are the companies we're kind of, at least we used to be fighting with to get cheaper internet access. And you kind of had, these government subsidy programs to say, hey, since internet is expensive, it's like $60, $80 a month. Can we subsidize that with like $30 per month of subsidy? I guess it's a very different model than what I'm used to, because in my head, those are the people you fight against, not the people doing the work. So I would like to learn more about, kind of why you think that difference is.
Yeah, Arushi, you want to take a stab at that and talk about how it's working in India and what more needs to be done?
So I think the first thing, as Sridhar mentioned, has been the overwhelming role that is being played by large corporates, especially with Reliance. Like when they launched Geo, their idea was to actually probably stand true on the promise that was made by the government about making digital ubiquitous, to make it reach every single household. And to that extent, they not only subsidize their internet plans to the point of it being extremely accessible to a very large part of society, but they also gave out free phones, at least when they launched. So it meant that, okay, if you did not have internet access to begin with, now you could get a free phone if you just bought a very cheap internet plan. So then your incentive was not to pick up a phone, but to get an internet plan to begin with, which is becoming cheaper than getting a phone and then getting an internet plan with it. So I think the first thing that they did was that they realized that for digital equity, or at least to begin this process of digitizing India, you need to give access to devices to people. And they did it through this method. And I think a large reason for that has also been that it is a company that has had the kind of money to be able to undertake this initiative for a large part. It knew that it had a base where its employees were far reaching. They weren't concentrated in any one single region. So if they had employees who had word of mouth, it's more likely that their program was going to spread than an NGO that did not have the kind of reach that they might have had. And I think the second key institution that played a role in this digitization process was the government itself, with so many of their current welfare schemes getting linked to the Aadhaar card, where it's becoming super important for you to be a part of the digital infrastructure and digital world, for you to have access to the state. A very quick example of that would be that in a lot of states today, if you want to go and get ration, which is already state subsidized food, you still need to have access to an Aadhaar card. And if you don't have a family member from that Aadhaar card added onto your ration card, you don't get ration that they are eligible to get. And that just shows that there is increasing reliance on just the amount of digital that is playing a role in these policies. And I think what needs to be done is recognizing the fact that, at least when it comes to a large population like India, we have to make it a little more inclusive. For instance, when the COVID app or the portal was launched for vaccinations, it was available only in English. This meant that only probably someone who's at least a little educated and can understand and make sense of the portal would be able to book a slot for vaccination, which effectively excluded a very large part of our society, which is the rural population, which doesn't necessarily get even primary education in English because they're taught in the state language. A second thing is that while we're talking about the fact that this gives a more systemic way of maintaining data, it allows the government to know who's getting what. There are large exclusion and inclusion errors that are associated when it comes to digital. This has been severely noted with welfare policies in India, where the amount of time it takes to get yourself added into the system is a lot longer than it would if you just went to the black market and got the same entitlement that you needed. So I think we need to acknowledge the fact that there are states like Tamil Nadu who refuse to go into a targeted PDI system simply because the social exclusion error of the digital is so large that they said that we don't want to deny anybody the right to food. So we refuse to go into a system that requires the digital. And I think those are two errors that we need to look at, whether when we're talking about digital being an enabler, are we really being inclusive? And are we acknowledging the fact that this is a process that does involve some amount of human error, some amount of human biases when it comes into getting people into the system? And will we be able to effectively overcome those to ensure that those who need access to the digital are able to get it?
Yeah, and if you look at, I mean, you talked about banking, Arushi. That's another big area of where there's been huge change in the last few years. From a time when India had less than 30% of the people had bank accounts, today almost 70, 80% of adults in India have access to a bank account, right? And that's change has happened in the last 10 years, let's say, right? In the last decade, that whole change has happened with this Jandan accounts, which is these bank accounts that were opened by everybody. And then you've got Aadhaar, which allows you to, which is gives everybody an identity. And then you've got mobile. So with these three things, India has sort of made it possible for us to deliver services and access to a much larger percentage of the population than was possible earlier. While we say this is there, it's the extent of access. We talk about access to devices. Now, the quality of the device makes a big difference in terms of what you can do with it and what you can't. Right? Somebody has like a small mobile phone, maybe even a smartphone, but with a tiny little screen in which they're trying to do a class. And then you have people like my daughter or Arushi, etc., who have like access to large computers and personal large personal devices with which they can do their studies and their work. Then you've got access to internet itself, right? So the high speed internet that we have access to, hundreds of mbps speeds compared to very slow speeds that these people have on their mobile phones. So I mean, that itself is a big divide. Then the quality of the camera that they've got, the quality of lighting that they have in the room, which allows them to access and do video calls. I think so. What do you do about that? I mean, how do you improve the quality of access to the quality of devices that are given to people and the quality of internet access? I mean, what have you been doing about that in the US?
So, based on what I'm hearing, I feel like what works in the US might be different from what works in India, but at least here, I think for quality, I think a lot of it comes with having corporate partners that believe in this. So getting donations from, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I know that there were lots of devices given out from a company that kind of believed in the digital divide. I know Microsoft is doing, they have this Airband project and they are kind of working directly to give out kind of brand new or newer devices. Here, finding kind of what Gio's already done, finding a corporate partner with like a large corporate partner like Microsoft or something that believes in it, they're looking to do CSR, and you just have to, I guess, make them aware of this divide. And usually, like 9 out of 10 times, they're interested because a lot of people that work there at least personally care about it, or they're interested in the space. And usually, there is kind of a CSR arm that's looking to do some work. So it's really just bridging the two. But at least apart from finding funding, that's pretty much the only thing I can add to it is finding large corporate partners that are willing to give out devices, because otherwise it's really, really hard here based on how the prices are and how the tiers work, because here you have to get a contract with a, if you do it postpaid, it is like a 2 or 3 year contract and you pay your phone off over 3 years. And the internet plans usually separate. The data costs in North America, I think, are 40 times higher than the cost in India. So there is a point where it kind of breaks, and it would be adapt rather than adopt in for India. But yeah, that's what I can think of right now.
Yeah, I think we have probably in India reasonably addressed the access to devices. The next step that many of us can do probably is, I'm thinking, why aren't more people going out to people's homes and collecting surplus phones? I have at least 3 extra phones in my house, right? Which from over the years, which because I've like changed my phone and I still have the old phone's still working. So I mean, we gave these away recently, but the point is that we could have, in a more systematic fashion, had a process by which you sort of collected old phones and, like, reused them. Old laptops and how those can be reused by people across, and, like, many more people can have access to them. You have governments like governments of Tamil Nadu and even Uttar Pradesh, which were going around giving all students a laptop. Every student above from class 10 and above or something was given a laptop a few years back. So we have those kind of schemes which are there. So access to devices, I think, is not terrible. I think it can definitely improve, but it's not bad. But I think we still struggle with access to the internet and good solid Arushi, what are your thoughts there? I mean, do you think like we have access to internet which is adequate, or?
I think when it comes to urban areas, you could say that the access to internet is sort of uniform, because at least the way I've seen it in Bombay is that you have just a few large providers that end up servicing the entire city. And having been at least using two of those providers over the last 8 years, you can say that, yeah, the speed isn't a problem, at least in the urban areas. I think what then becomes, or at least what I see being a problem, is that a large part of the internet that we rely on for, say, looking for jobs or upskilling ourselves is something that's available in just one language. And it's generally English, because it's made for the educated masses, so to speak. Yet, the solutions that we are targeting are for people who don't necessarily use English as a language they're very comfortable in. So I think the first goal that comes down to us would be not just having a Google Translate version that just translate everything word to word, because half the time it's a transliteration rather than a translation, which ends up losing half the meaning of what the website really wanted to convey. So maybe the project that lies ahead for whoever wants to take up this task of digital equity in India, beyond just enabling access to devices and the internet, would be to ensure that the internet is really accessible in a meaningful manner to the people who are using it. Now, that could mean having more graphics. Like, from what I remember, is when Amazon was launched in regional languages, they knew that people weren't very comfortable typing out the stuff that they would need. So they included the feature of, it was launched first in the rural areas, was that you could take a picture of what you needed and it would do AI and give you the exact product and versions of it. It was only later launched in urban areas, from what I know. So maybe adapting technologies, knowing the kind of people we're servicing. So if we're looking at upskilling, as we thought of with the career impact bonds, we know that the people we're targeting are those that come from a different background than someone who uses Coursera or EDX. So we create portals for our institutions, for websites to upskill themselves, if not physical institutes that could cater to them. I think that would be what lies ahead for us.
So when I look at the future, I'm an optimist, and I think digital is going to, yes, it's going to continue to divide people. Access to digital is never going to be perfectly equal, but we do need to fix some of these things. And I think having corporate partners, having some CSR funds step in, having interested citizens take the trouble, and each one of us, like, taking it upon ourselves to teach 4 or 5 other people how to use the internet better, train them on access use of those devices, and maybe helping them with and providing access to repairs, etc., I think is important. There was a lot of advocacy which happened for digital in India, especially with, I mean, while I have a whole lot of objections to the demonetization that happened many years ago and all that, but nevertheless, I think it did. There are some positive spin-offs that did happen, which is around the percentage of transactions in India which went digital post that. Today, you can go to a small pawn shop in India and use Google Pay and pay for a bar of chocolate, or you could pick up or pay for a cup of tea. This morning, I'd gone to the park for a walk, and then outside the park there was a little van which was selling dosas. I ate a dosa and then I paid for it with my mobile wallet, right? So I think things are changing. The kind of things that are going to be possible, I think, while we see today young people from poorer homes struggling to get educated, struggling to have the same quality of education that they were having in the past, and the difference between kids in richer homes and the kind of education that they're able to have with far superior digital devices, while that's going to be true, I think the future will be with more people having access to these devices, even the poorer people having access to these devices, and having access to better teachers than they've ever had before. I think today, because if the education is delivered in a digital manner, now you can have teachers from anywhere in the world. Why only in India, right? Talking about interesting subject. You could have somebody like a Feynman talking about physics to people and making physics fun, right? I mean, I think things like that would not have been possible in the past. Secondly, if you look at telemedicine, most of us have now, there was a lot of resistance to telemedicine in the past. Even though technology existed to do telemedicine, people didn't really do it. But now the pandemic forced a lot of people to use telemedicine in order to consult with a doctor. Now, extending the same idea, if you have better internet access in villages tomorrow, what if you had your primary health center in a village with access to internet and telemedicine? So somebody goes to a primary health center in a village, but has access to consultant doctors from the best hospitals in India, right? Also listening in to the problem and then doing and somebody does, maybe the local person does the triaging, while the real consultation can come and expertise can come from doctors in large hospitals with etc. So I think that so many more things can be done with digital. I think we should not do things which are preventing digital from becoming the de facto way of doing something. Things should be designed, products and services should be designed as digital first, but we should also be aware and mindful of the inequity that exists and the steps that need to be taken to towards this equity. Any final thoughts, Raghav?
I hate to end on a tangent, but I guess a final thought would be while designing these is to also keep in mind privacy, because I feel like we could unintentionally spur a new kind of digital equity issue down the road if everything is digital and everyone is signing privacy policies that they don't understand. And now Google has every single transaction from your pawn shop to your dosa to everything. And now you start getting ads for the dosa wala next to you, or they know what, I mean, with AI being advanced enough to do image recognition of an object in poor lighting, I personally don't think it would be a huge leap of faith to think that it could also do some pretty advanced, I guess, analysis or prediction of desires. And something I have been thinking about lately is future advertising, where it's advertising things you hadn't even realized you were thinking of buying. And I've been reading some interesting books that talk about how that could be, it's kind of an information divide, because you have a few corporations that know every single thought and action and heartbeat of every other individual. And then you have a bunch of individuals using those services, feeding those algorithms. So making sure that with everything going digital, you're doing it in a way where everyone, almost preceding it with making sure everyone's data is their own before you make them go digital, because otherwise it just seems like putting the cart before the horse.
Brilliant. Arushi?
No, I fully agree with that. Like, even in the last semester, I did a course that the biggest problem that while everyone's been talking about how great Aadhaar is and it's being such a great enabler, is doing away with data being segregated. We're making all of our transactions, which were in these separate silos, now available in this one common medium. And it's through the government or for anybody in the wrong hands to have access to your entire life just away with a click. And I think that is also something that we need to be careful with, that when you're creating digital equity, well, that is in for the right reasons. We also back it up with enough security for the very people who are going to be using it, because otherwise maybe one step forward could end up being two step backwards because you would scared the very next generation that's going to have to use these devices further.
Yeah. So thank you very much. I think that's absolutely true. I agree that, while digital has lots of promise and is showing the way to progress and change in society at scale, there are lots of dangers which we need to overcome and be aware of and cognizant of. We can easily be waylaid by and overwhelmed by some of these issues. And I think it's important to be cognizant of them and mindful of them. So thank you very much for this very interesting conversation, and talk to you again soon.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
We know you love fast food,
Fast fashion,
faster payment.
lightning fast internet speed.
Then why not fast information?
On Think Fast, where we discuss the latest developments in the world of technology, business, marketing, pop culture.
With a side of sarcasm and my dad jokes, not just mine.
Not mine, Varun. My jokes are funny. So join me, guys, the funnier one, Suchita Salvan, co-founder of LBB.
And me, Varun Dugirala, the co-founder of The Glitch, as we think fast only on the IVM network.
Fresh episodes out every Monday.
On the IVM app, website, or wherever you get your podcast from.
What is the workplace and how does your gender and body affect your right at work? Hey, I'm Priya Mirza, and on the Longest Constitution podcast, we critically examine the vision of the Indian Constitution and laws. In season 1, we looked at sex, gender, sexuality in India, and the landmark judgments which transformed our rights as citizens in this country. In season 2, we discussed the laws which shape the workplace and examine how ability, competence, and merit impact us, and much more. Join me, Priya Mirza, every Wednesday only on the IVM Podcast app, website, and all the major podcast streaming platforms.